Hi everyone and welcome to the garden. It's been the warmest day of the year here so far, around 22 degrees, and it's great to be able to come back from work and see the plants actually growing, hear the bumblebees, people out on the motorbikes. It actually feels like spring's here at last. And today I want to look at 4 of the plants that form the most dramatic pieces of my summer garden, and if you see what they're like now, then you'll really appreciate just how impressive the growth is that they'll put on over the next month or so. Starting off then, let's look at Musa Basjoo, which is the hardy Japanese green banana. If you don't grow Musa Basjoo yet, then you certainly should. They're one of the most impressive tropical foliage plants, and by the middle of summer they can look something like this, with massive green paddle-shaped leaves. From a plant that's maybe 30 centimetres or a foot tall, you can reach 5 or even 6 foot from your first season alone. And if you overwinter that plant successfully outside, then come the following year, it'll start to send up other stems and start to create a massive clump of these huge, great big green leaves. So it's a huge plant, it gives massive impact to tropical garden, and the main reason it's so popular is because it can survive outside through our winters. And in mild winters, or maybe even average winters in some warmer areas, you don't even need to protect it at all. I know I didn't protect my clump back in the previous winter, so 2019 to 20, and we had a mild winter that year, it was absolutely fine. This year, I started off again not protecting it, but then I saw the cold spell coming up in February and I thought I would protect it. So by protecting it, all I did, put 4 canes around the plant, wrap them in fleece, put a load of straw inside to insulate the growth a bit, and then I put a pot on top to keep all the water out of it, because that would start to rot it through. And what's left after the winter is basically this. So as you can see, each stem is starting to grow now, and what you do when you actually unwrap them, I tend to unwrap them some point around March, is chop the stems back, get rid of all the mushy growth and take it back to where it feels firm. And all that mushy stuff, it's dead growth. You might lose a bit of height, and I think I lost a bit of height this year purely because I wrapped it so late and the ground was maybe a bit wet and some of that moisture came up through the straw, which obviously isn't ideal. But as you can see, although I've lost a bit of height, they've started growing again, pushing out these new rollers. One tip I would give for Musa Basjoo is that you need to be patient with them. They're one of the fastest growing plants from May onwards, and certainly in the hotter months of July and August, if you give them plenty of water and good feed, then they can put out 1 or 2 leaves every single week. But from March through till May, the growth is a bit on the slow side. They start to push out these weak leaves. I guess they haven't had the exposure to the sunlight, they might have grown a bit in your protection and be a bit weak. And these new leaves, they can easily get damaged by the wind, any frosts, so don't be disheartened if they start to look a bit tatty. Trust me that by May or early June at least, they'll start to grow really quickly, and by July you'll have forgotten all about the fact that they're quite dull for half of the year. Another thing I'd say is if you've already unwrapped your Musa Basjoo, it's worth keeping your frost protection fleece just to one side in case we get another cold spell in April. Who knows whether it's going to be a mild April or it might be a colder April. Ultimately, the main thing that will affect your banana plant is frost. So if you see temperatures of less than 2 or 3 degrees forecast, it's worth just popping that fleece over the banana plant, and you might protect the tender new growth at the top and have a better plant come May. But in all honesty, hopefully we shouldn't get any damaging cold in the next month or so. Fingers crossed. We'll see what happens, but it really takes some severe cold to kill your bananas. You do see people on Facebook commenting that they never protect the Musa Basjoos or never do anything to look after it. That's fine in mild areas. If you live in the middle of London, it might be absolutely fine. And if you don't care about how tall or impressive the plant is, that's fine. But personally, I would probably take the risk at the start of winter that it might be a mild one. But if there is cold forecast within the next couple of weeks, and by cold, I mean any prolonged freezing temperatures, less than -2, -3 degrees, then that has the potential to freeze your stems through, rot them through. It's not ideal. So if you want to keep the height of those stems, or as much as possible, it is worth protecting it in my opinion. You then get a plant that's starting off from 4 or 5 foot tall, and it's going to be, huge by the end of summer, rather than something that's having to regrow from the ground. The roots themselves are really hardy. I've seen figures like -15, -20 written down, but we don't have a lot of summer heat in the UK. As you know, we get a few really hot days over 30 degrees. In countries, or say in areas like the middle of the USA, or even in some Eastern European countries, they get temperatures pushing 40 degrees and a lot of warm temperatures over 30. And there, banana plants can be cut down to the ground every winter and grow up and still reach 6 or 7 foot tall every year, not a problem. But here in the UK, we tend to have cooler summers. In my opinion at least, it's worth protecting the stems just to get that extra height and an even more impressive plant come summer. Next up, and I know I say this a lot, we've got one of my favourite plants, and that's Gunnera Manicata, the giant rhubarb. And I've actually got 3 plants in the garden, which hopefully aren't too closely spaced together. Now, it's such an impressive plant for many reasons, but the one single factor is just the size of it. The leaves on a proper Manicata, not a Tinctoria, get maybe 1.5 to 3 metres across. Obviously that'll need ideal conditions, but it's absolutely huge. They're really impressive, and they certainly fit with the whole prehistoric jungle theme I've got going on. And the plants I've got here right now look something like this. So I've got 3 plants in the garden. This one, which is a small offset the year before last. Moving around, we've got this, which is my main plant. You can see it's from a larger clump. And here is another offset. Now, as you might notice, there's a lot of room around them. Partly that's because there's actually plants like hostas, that's an Empress Wu there, which will fill up a lot of space, but the main reason is because these Gunneras get absolutely massive, and if anything, they might be planted a little bit closely together. So when it came to winter last year, all you do around late October, November time is chop off the old leaves. The stems actually get quite thick, say around 40-50 mil. You chop off the old leaves and use them as a form of umbrella really to wrap and cover the plant, just keep layering them over it. And one thing I did find last year is that those old leaves started to blacken a bit with all the frost and the rain and get a bit mushy. So in the end, what I did is just put a big pot over the top of the plants with some straw inside, and that kept the frost off, kept the temperatures up a little bit, and as you can see, they've started growing already. Now, if your Gunnera hasn't already started growing, then I wouldn't worry. Partly because it's not always an advantage if your plants grow too early, because all this new growth is very susceptible to frost. And one thing you do find with Gunnera is that the first leaves, these 2 here, end up being the largest. So you really want to protect them, and you might find they come to a size by the middle of April where they're too big to protect, and they might get a bit of damage. So realistically, it's not the worst thing if yours haven't started growing yet. But I just wanted to show them today purely because it's amazing that these little leaves, which can fit in my hand right now, will probably be 1.5 meters wide in around a month, maybe 5 weeks. It's absolutely incredible. The next plant I want to look at are Ensetes, and they're a banana type plant with really impressive green-red leaves. They look incredible with the sun behind them. It brings out all sorts of yellows and oranges, and like the Musa Basjoo, they're a plant that grows really quickly. So if you pick up a plant that's maybe £5 or £10 this spring, if you plant it out in May after the frost, then by October that will be 6 foot tall and a statement piece in its own right. So in my opinion, you don't have to buy them large to get a really impressive plant, and they grow so quickly, it's worth getting a few in. And personally, it's going to be one of my feature plants for this summer's planting. I've got around 10 to 15 Ensetes. I think they've all made it through winter, so it'd be really great to have them all outside as a plant that's repeated throughout the garden to really add that drama. Now, the crucial thing with Ensetes is that they won't survive outside in the UK. You might hear 1 or 2 people maybe getting away with it, but they're definitely the exception rather than the rule. As a plant, you might hear on certain TV programmes that they can't take any frost, and that's not true either. They can take a bit of frost, it will damage the leaves, but I've personally had plants outside in -1, -2. They'll take it, they won't like it, and if they have that for weeks on end or even days, then that's it, they'll just turn to mush. So it's worth storing them inside from either late October, early November, through till probably late April or early May, just to be on the safe side. And if you're buying these or the Musa Basjoo small this spring, then I'll definitely wait until early to mid-May after the frosts have finished before you plant them outside. So the first one that I want to look at is actually a Montbéliardii, which is similar to Maurelii. It's maybe a bit more stretched looking, the leaves are a bit longer, and they've got a sort of purple mottle into them, whereas the normal Maurelii has got more of a red colour to it. So this is one of my plants here, and the first thing you might notice if you've seen some of my pictures on Instagram last year is how much it's actually shrunk down from when I brought them in. If you saw them last sort of September, October, then I know they're not technically called a trunk, but the trunk itself was about that big. So over winter, unlike a lot of people, they've actually slimmed down and they've lost a lot of water weight. Now, the most popular and best way of overwintering them, especially when they get to a decent size, is to dry store them. If you try to grow them over winter as a house plant, it will end badly. There isn't enough light for them, whereas the heat will keep them growing, so they'll end up getting stretched up and be really susceptible to pests and diseases. Personally, I don't dry store mine, and that's purely because I don't have somewhere cool and dark. Ideally, they need to be kept between 5 and 10 degrees and really dry through winter. The dryness is the critical bit. Here at the new house, I haven't got a greenhouse, maybe more news on that front soon, but my Ensetes have to stay in an end room. So what I've done is I've given them as much light as possible, and I've kept the compost that they're in absolutely dry. So basically what I did, dug the plants up, I think it was late October. I actually had them potted because we moved house last year, but all I did was dug them up, chopped off most of the roots, brushed off as much soil as I could, chopped all the leaves off, and then I sat them in the smallest pots I could. I didn't put any more compost around them, so essentially they're sort of dry stored, but I didn't go to the point of cleaning everything off them. I just sat them in some pots and let the central heating actually dry them out. At the minute then, most of my Ensetes look something like this. And as you can see, I've basically chopped off all of the root ball when I dug it up last year. It definitely looks a lot slimmer than it was when I brought it in, and it does look a bit tatty with all these dead leaves on the sides. So what I'll do at some point over the next couple of weeks, time isn't critical, but I don't want them to start growing too quickly. However, I would like them to be ready for the start of May. So what I'll do, probably this next weekend, is basically take every plant, chop these dead leaves off, tidy it up a bit. I'll put fresh compost in the pot up to around there, put the plant back in, pot it up, and only give it a small amount of moisture. You don't want to give it too much too quickly, and the last thing I want is for the plants to start setting off straight away and put out loads of leaves because I haven't got enough room for them. So the key is just give them a little bit of water at first, increase it every week, and they grow that fast that by the early May they'll have 2 or 3 really big leaves and they'll be ready to start to harden off and go into the final planting spots outside. A couple of seasonal tips for Ensetes then. Firstly, you might find, especially at this time of year, if you bring them out of dry storage, you've got some bits of mould, fungus, or even some small insects around, especially the ends of the dead leaves, and it's not the end of the world. You can just brush those off, and that will be my advice really. Before you pot the plant up, just make sure everything's brushed off, you've trimmed all that dead matter off, and the plants will look a lot neater, a lot tidier. Those bugs won't be a problem when you actually plant them outside. And the other thing will be, Ensetes can be affected by a condition known as the strangles, which is where they start putting out smaller leaves that don't look anything like the usual typical leaves. And the best thing to do with this is basically just chop the top of the plant completely off. I've had this happen a couple of times over the years. If you Google it, you'll see pictures of what I mean, but it's not a problem, it's not the end of the world. And if you chop the top of that plant straight off, it'll continue growing, and in my experience, they put out perfectly normal leaves. The last plant I want to look at today then are Tetrapanax, and I grow a few different varieties in the garden. Just noticed how much it smells down here. The fritillaria plants are really growing this time of year, and the smell is, we'll say it's unmistakable. But yes, Tetrapanax. I grow a few different varieties, the standard Papyrifer, the Rex form, and also Steroidal Giant, which in theory is even bigger and even more impressive. And as you can see at the minute, this is just a small plant. That's a leaf that's been frosted off at the back end of winter, and this is the new growth here. And they do look generally like this. What you find is that plants in more exposed areas might not have the new growth yet, and those with a bit of shelter, or if you live somewhere warmer, they'll be properly grown away now. One thing I would say with these is that there's no point protecting this new growth unless there's a real cold spell coming up, because it will get frosted off, but new growth will still appear to replace it. So with these, the best thing you can do is actually just let them grow naturally, because one thing I have found is that if you protect Tetrapanax, if you really try to wrap it up, let's just say that's the only time I've actually lost a plant. So it's worth leaving them to it. They are deciduous in our climate, but it's not the end of the world, and they will start growing very strongly in the next month. Just to illustrate my last point, here's a plant without any overhead cover or protection. There's no surrounding plants, and you can see it's only just started growing. But a couple of metres away, under the shelter of these slightly frosted tree ferns and palm trees, there's another plant, and it's already put out a couple of small leaves. So it really does depend on your location and the microclimate around the plant itself. But they should start growing in the next couple of weeks. And they're another plant that might only have small leaves now, but give it another month, 6 weeks, those leaves can be maybe 3 or 5 foot across. and the plants themselves get tall very quickly. So I've got a bank of them through here, which in theory are going to rise up above these tree ferns and give a really sort of magical tropical canopy. I've probably got around 10 to 15 plants in total in the garden, and going off Facebook, they're probably the #1 plant that a lot of people have in the gardens that gets people asking, what is that? They're just so impressive. So that's the end of today's roundup, and that's Ensete. We're going back inside with the others, where it'll stay until late April or early May. If it's a mild spell forecast, I might bring them out for a bit of sun, but realistically it takes a bit of effort to bring them out and put them back in again, so they might just stay inside until that risk of frost is completely over, which is usually the 1st or 2nd week of May for us here in North Lincolnshire. But the Gunnera, the Tetrapanax and the Musa Basjoo, they'll all be staying outside exactly where they've been all winter, and I'll let them grow at their own pace. I won't start to feed or water them a lot just until they've really started growing, and if there is any frost damage, it's not the end of the world. They will soon bounce back, and as we're now into April nearly, there shouldn't really be any killing temperatures, fingers crossed, but if there is a hard frost or anything, it is what it is. They'll soon come back, don't worry about it. And there's only really the Gunnera that I go to those extra lengths to protect, because I know how big those first leaves can get. One thing I would end on is by saying that if you bought any of these plants recently, if you bought them over winter and they're small plants in small pots, maybe they might already be in full growth, then those you need to treat them, although they're hardy, as a tender plant. At a small size and as a plant that's used to being in a warm polytunnel or greenhouse, they won't be used to our outdoor exposure and temperatures, and if you put them outside now, if you actually plant them outside, then best case is the frost will probably get them a bit and they'll end up being set back by a month or so. Worst case is they won't like the shock of being planted into cold earth and they'll start to go downhill very rapidly or maybe even rot away. So if you bought one of these recently, keep it inside, give it as much light as possible, so put it on a windowsill or somewhere as bright as you can possibly get it, and I'd certainly wait until the back end of April or realistically early May before you plant them outside. Thanks for watching then, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Coming up, I've got some videos in the garden progress here. With the lighter nights and the ground slowly starting to dry out, I've really been able to get on, and it's exciting to see it finally start to take shape, especially after such a long winter. And I've also got some short videos coming out, how-tos on how to sow different seeds and how to germinate various palms, as well as how to get some plants started from the winter dormancy. So keep an eye out for those. I hope to see you soon. Thanks for watching.